Welcome to this week's Humanities Forum. My name is Raymond Hain. I'm a member of the Philosophy Department here at PC and the director of the Humanities Forum. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to this Friday's special event. I want to extend a special welcome to our off-campus guests who are here for the third annual Aristotelian Conference. Part of the purpose of the forum is to provide a regular space each week for reflection on some of the deepest issues we face in the humanities. One way we do that is to partner with conferences on campus and host keynote addresses when we can. It's a particular pleasure for us today to host our guest, Candace Vogler from the University of Chicago. Please now join me, though, in welcoming Dr. Colin King from the Philosophy Department here, who will introduce this afternoon's guest.
Thanks very much. I'll make it very brief so that this is like a book, you know, it's got a preface and then an introduction, and then finally you get to the real thing. So I'll try to make the introduction short too. This is the third annual conference on philosophy in the Aristotelian tradition. It's a conference that brings together people who work in the field of ancient philosophy, and in particular on Aristotle, with people who work in the history of medieval philosophy and Arabic philosophy. And this seems like kind of an obvious thing to do in a Dominican institution where you have Thomas Aquinas, who was heavily influenced by both Aristotle and the Arabic commentary tradition. And still one can be really grateful, and I want to express my gratitude to the Dominican community for generously sponsoring this conference, which is kind of a unique conference, I think, in the history of philosophy. Now, I also have to thank Raymond Hain very much. Where is he? He went away. For the Humanities Forum and its sponsoring of this conference. The Humanities Forum doesn't just put on events, it also funds events in its own right. So that's a sponsor of this endeavor, and I'm really grateful for that. So that's the end of the introduction of that. Now an introduction to Candace Vogler, who's professor at the University of Chicago and who works on moral philosophy. As I was telling Candace earlier today, my first exposure to her work was in kind of an informal context where a text of hers was put on my desk when I was a young, still dissertating person. It was an extract from her book, Reasonably Vicious, which is a book on Aquinas and many other things. And I was so distraught, shaken up by reading this really lucid account of moral problems, really difficult moral problems, actually a lucid, and the technical term in Greek rhetoric is energeia, a completely clear depiction of evil circumstances, and then a clear-eyed analysis, a kind of dispassionate analysis of what kind of ethical problems they involved. It actually really disturbed me, and I didn't like it, I have to say at first. Later, I realized how important that kind of philosophical work is, and it's a mark of not only cool philosophical reflection, but real keen empathy. And that's a combination that's really unique and that I think is characteristic of her work, and that's why I'm really glad to have her here today.
Thank you. I have a mic that's attached to me. Can everybody hear me? Just on its base. Okay, good. I need a roving mic because I wander around a lot, especially in discussion. I am delighted to be here and very, very honored to get to be part of the Humanities Forum and this wonderful conference that we're having. I am going to talk to you about the place of virtue in a meaningful life. This is work that grows partly out of a 3-year-long Templeton Foundation grant that we've just drawn to a close that was called, after the fashion of Templeton grants, Virtue, Happiness, and the Meaning of Life. That's a topic. Okay. It may be that talk about virtue has never been common in ordinary life. It may be that the only common talk about virtue in North America happened a long time ago and was primarily concerned with women and their sexual habits, where virtue concerned chastity. But in the latter part of the 20th century, Anglophone philosophers started talking about virtue again. And we now confront a wide variety of different kinds of talk about virtue in both moral philosophy and areas of empirical social science directed to exploration of moral psychology and moral education. By most of these lights, a specific virtue is a character trait that tends to make its bearer a better person than she would be without it, and the sorts of virtues that are topics of inquiry among philosophers and psychologists mostly are acquired virtues, virtues that develop through training and practice. There are accounts of virtue that find their philosophical ancestor in the 18th century Scottish philosopher David Hume. There are accounts of virtue that draw extensively from the work of Roman thinkers like Cicero, being American. There are accounts of virtue rooted in work by the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle. The theorist of virtue I have found most useful is a scholastic neo-Aristotelian, Thomas Aquinas. For Aquinas, there are 4 cardinal virtues: practical wisdom, justice, temperance, and courage. We need all 4. Michael Pakaluk puts the point this way, quote, "A virtue is a trait that makes someone such that his activity, what he does, what he's responsible for, reasonable." But there are 4 basic types of such activity: his thinking itself as practical and directed at action, his actions ordinarily so called, and how he is affected. This last category splits into 2, Aquinas thinks, on the grounds that acting reasonably in the realm of the passions involves regulating both the passions by which we're drawn to something and the passions by which we are repulsed from something. These 2 sorts of passions imply 2 sorts of tasks or achievements which the ordinary distinction between the virtues of temperance and courage confirms. Close quote. Virtues foster coordination and cooperation among our various powers in such a way that we can pursue human good and avoid what's bad for us smoothly and well. Aquinas is writing in the context of thinking about post-lapsarian human life. The fall in this view was an occasion when we lost something called original justice. Original justice was a situation where all of our powers were coordinated and harmonious. We only got it with a lot of supernatural help, but the powers are actually made to fit together and cooperate in various ways. So it's supposed to be the case that my appetites want to be reasonable. They want to be governed by reason. And that reason actually wants to be subordinate to God. That's how they're made to work. The loss of original justice is the loss of the coordination of all those powers. I'm here relying very strongly on a beautiful tiny paper published in the late 1930s by a Jesuit called P. de Letter, but I think it's the best account of loss of original justice I've ever seen. Anyway, that means that unlike a lot of God's other creatures, we don't automatically find ourselves drawn to only things that are good for us, and only drawn to the extent that they're good for us. And we don't only find ourselves repelled by stuff that's bad for us, and only to the extent that it's bad for us. it's different. It's hard in a way it's not for like cats and dogs, unless they've been around humans so much that they're sort of neurotic. But they get that from us. Anyway, in this sense, the unity of the virtues for Aquinas is drawn from the unity of the human person seeking to live a reasonable life. And for Aquinas, even a fully virtuous person, I'm talking acquired virtues here, is likely to make mistakes in trying to act well. If I did have the full complement of active and beautifully coordinated acquired virtues, that's not going to obviate the need to go to confession, which means that there will be things I rightly regret about what I do or fail to do, say or fail to say, and so on. At least I see nothing in Aquinas to suggest that the virtuous man has no reason for regret. On some readings of Aristotle, the Phronimos would never go to confession. Like, why? Because he'd never make those mistakes. Okay. Sorry, I'm getting over a cold. Secondary virtues, generosity, for instance, or humility, or gratitude, or kindness, work to strengthen and support the operation of cardinal virtues on this picture. Cultivating virtues is part of sound moral development, and sound moral development is crucial to human life on this view. Unlike non-human animals, humans need more than just a combination of good fortune, instinct, and training to lead good lives. We need developed characters. Some contemporary neo-Aristotelians and some more venerable theorists think that acquired virtue is all that we need to lead a good human life. They think that living virtuously is enough to make us happy, and that since virtue is its own reward, living virtuously ought to be enough to make our lives full and meaningful as well. For those who think that virtue is all we need, what virtue does, for the most part, is make each of us a stronger and better person. This will give the virtuous person a measure of resilience when things do not go her way. It will help guide her when exercising virtue looks to put her at a tremendous disadvantage, as it will, for instance, if she's called upon to deliver truthful testimony in a court condemning a mob boss, or if she's called upon to care for an infirm parent who is demanding, ungrateful, and generally unkind, or if being mindful of the needs of her children and spouse requires turning down a very shiny job offer in a distant place. Virtuous activity can put the virtuous person at risk of death, misery, or serious personal disappointment. And in general, one would have to be appallingly lacking in imagination to be incapable of thinking of anything more exciting to do than pay debts, help those in need, or work not to lie, cheat, abandon others, or steal when bad acts offer big rewards. Aquinas knows that virtuous action can put the virtuous person at a disadvantage as far as worldly success is concerned. He does not think that having a developed good character will, all on its own, make everything go well for the virtuous person. But his understanding of virtue has two features that are uncommon in other accounts of virtue, both of which give virtue a proper place in a meaningful life. First, any specific virtue is directed to common good for Aquinas. Although he shares the general Aristotelian conviction that my virtues, if I have any, are good for me, the benefit that I get from my own good character is not the most interesting thing about my virtues for Aquinas. What my virtues do is direct me to a good larger than just my own welfare and the welfare of those in my inner circle. Although what Aquinas means by saying that virtue is directed to common good in the first instance is not exactly what contemporary Anglophone philosophers generally mean by invoking common good, and although the reach of Aquinas' thought about common good is disputed by a lot of scholars of Aquinas, it's not even clear that the phrase means the same thing every time it's used. Aquinas' understanding is not opposed to what contemporary Anglophone philosophers might mean by common good either. The commonality, at the broadest reading you can give of this in Aquinas, as near as I can tell, reaches out toward the whole of creation. It could be that big, that much in common, cosmically common good. The sort of thing that could lead you to develop an environmental ethics out of Aquinas based on some thought about stewardship or something. The human community is, of course, part of creation. And virtue is inherently directed to the good of the larger human community on this view, in a way that makes virtue inherently self-transcendent. Okay? Now, there may be some neo-Aristotelian accounts of virtue that are rightly charged with painting a picture of the individual human being who's trying to have virtue or improve herself or something, as more interested in the beauty of her own soul than she is in whether she's of any use to anyone else. By insisting that there's no such thing as an entirely idiosyncratic or self-involved, self-absorbed virtue, Aquinas' account escapes this charge. So you can't think that this is some sort of moral narcissism on display, as you can with some other neo-Aristotelian accounts. Secondly, and relatedly, Aquinas does not think that happiness and a sense of meaning in this life are the highest objects of aspiration for us. The highest object of aspiration is eternal happiness in a resurrected life. We can't get that for ourselves without God's help, but in a strong sense, it's what we're made for. And virtue in this life supports us in our efforts to be right with ourselves, right with our fellow creatures, and right with God. No matter how, I can't get myself there without a hand up. But I can at least do my best to be in balance while I'm here, which is not nothing. Okay, so much for a super quick introduction to virtue in Aquinas. What place do our efforts at moral self-improvement have in meaningful lives? Why is this relevant to questions about meaning? I will approach concern over meaning in human lives rather than say, the meaning of human life, which is another matter, through 20th century and recent mainstream philosophy. Among Anglophone philosophers who understand themselves to be working in what gets called the analytic tradition, although almost none of these does strictly analytic philosophy these days, meaning in life is a new and hot topic. Those in the area often point to venerable sources. Now, I'm in favor of looking to historical figures in philosophy for insights into many questions. But there are good reasons for thinking that Susan Wolf was not wrong to claim in 2010 that, quote, academic philosophers do not talk much about meaningfulness in life, close quote, and that, quote, most philosophers have failed to notice it altogether, close quote. Or to suggest with Robert Adams that same year that Anglophone philosophers, quote, have published relatively little about meaningfulness in life, despite its apparently profound human importance, close quote. As near as I can tell, what the contemporary academic philosophers are doing in claiming Aristotle or Immanuel Kant as their sources for thought about meaning is either assimilating concern over meaning in life to concern over final ends, things pursued for their own sake that organize and lend coherence to one's other pursuits, or else assimilating questions about meaning in life to questions about what makes for a good human life. Strictly, as near as I can tell, questions about what makes life meaningful are relatively new questions in European philosophy. It looks to me as though the topic started to rise up explicitly for European thinkers in the wake of what was called the Great War, and again with different urgency in the wake of their Second World War. Partly in response to the utter destructiveness of these ventures, and pointedly after the second of our world wars, in response to the way that neighbors turned on neighbors during efforts to annihilate Jewish people, gypsies, people with leftist political views, homosexual people, and disabled people, and to enslave many other peoples. In mainstream English language philosophy, the topic of meaning in life, taken up in those terms, did not get much currency until late in the 20th century. Part of the reason that mainstream Anglophone philosophers are reluctant to wade into questions about meaning in life is that there is no single, clear, precise characterization of what counts as meaning in this area. There are desiderata, conditions that any adequate account of meaning in human life ought to meet if the view is to be a view about the sort of thing that despairing people find elusive and people leading significant and meaningful lives have. Anglophone philosophers, being the kinds of intellectuals that we are, every one of the points I'm about to list as a reasonable starting point for thought about what makes life meaningful has been contested by at least one of the people taking up the question in the last 30 years. We're nothing if not obstreperous. I will, for all that, move forward boldly rather than tracing out the disputations for you. Here are what I take to be reasonable starting points for thought about what makes life meaningful. Do we have handouts at this point? Does everybody have it? Okay. These should be on a handout, as should Mr. Pakaluk's quote. 1. Meaning in human life is not merely a matter of subjective satisfaction with how things are going. People enduring serious hardship and shouldering great burdens can be leading tremendously meaningful lives, even when they do not expect that their efforts in any of their areas of activity will succeed. By the same token, people can be perfectly content with how things are going in their lives and be spending much of their time and energy on things of little consequence. 2. Meaning in human life has an important objective dimension. I can take it that my life has not been worth living and be wrong. By the same token, I can take it that my life is filled with meaning and be wrong. 3, related to 1 and 2. To whatever extent assessments of happiness in life are importantly subjective, happiness is distinct from meaningfulness. 4. Whatever kinds of activities, relationships, ways of living, or experiences contribute to meaning in human life, meaningful lives are better than meaningless lives. That is, meaning is not a purely descriptive term in this setting. 5. Related to 4, there is an important distinction between meaning in life and moral status. however moral status is assessed. Full lives, empty lives, and lives that are neither especially full nor especially empty have moral status. I'm willing to just assert that. I hope you don't scream. I'm hoping this is an audience that holds that, like, human lives have moral status, period. Next. Okay. There are various ways to carve the territory of recent Anglophone philosophical work on meaning in life. My starting points put me on one side of the great divide between subjectivist and objectivist accounts. Subjectivist accounts have two things to be said in their favor. First, since empirical work on the topic tends to rely on self-reports, subjectivist accounts of meaning in life can make use of a lot of recent psychological research on meaningful lives. I have not found empirical research in psychology that relies upon an objectivist construe of meaning in life. It's really hard to imagine it even happening. If you talk to empirical psychologists, which I do a lot, they're like, we know. Who knows? Second, since the topic is often highly charged, we're worried, say, about high suicide rates or other indicators of self-destructive impulses among our youth, or we're worried about very privileged adults leading lives of quiet desperation. It can feel, however inchoately, even to academic philosophers, that what is called for is an account of how individuals might make sense of their lives to and for themselves. The subjectivists are interested in understanding what's going on when I take my life to be meaningful. It's an important topic, and it's not one that those of us who tend to find concern over final ends or what makes life worth living, we folks don't want to ignore that question. But to the extent that a person thinks about her own life and how things are with her own life, to the extent that that kind of thing, that those things can come apart from an assessment of meaning, there's room for a significant objective element in thought about meaning in life. Another clear line of distinction in recent work demarcates naturalist views from supernaturalist views. Supernaturalist views hold that our relations to and participation in a spiritual order is crucial to having a meaningful life. Such views, notice, might be true even if there is no such thing as the variety of spiritual order postulated by the relevant supernaturalist theorist of meaning. Okay. If there is no such order, then our lives are not lives that can be meaningful by these lights. That's all. Some supernaturalist views are distinctively theistic. Ordinarily, these are monotheistic views focused on our relation to God. Other supernaturalist views find a spiritual order in the natural world, sometimes linked to pantheistic or polytheistic understandings of that order. These latter varieties of supernaturalism have not been explored extensively in the Anglophone philosophical literature. The philosophers have stuck with monotheism for the most part. There tend to be three important dimensions to monotheistic supernaturalist views about meaning in life. First, there's a metaphysical dimension. God's existence is necessary to ground meaningful lives because an infinite, essentially good, almighty creator and legislator God anchors objective value generally and the objective value of human life as part of this. Second, a relational dimension. A meaningful life is informed by sound, if necessarily incomplete, understanding of God, and involved in practical engagements that bring individual human beings into right relations with God. Third, an ethical dimension. It's not possible to be in right relations with God unless one is also in right relations with one's fellow human beings. And all three of those are part of all the supernaturalist views. Naturalist views, on the other hand, hold that there is no supernatural, distinctively spiritual order, but that this is no hindrance to thinking about what makes life meaningful. On such views, I could find meaning in life through pursuit of truth or justice, or by understanding my life as made possible by the struggles of people who came before me, hoping to carry good forward to those who will come after me. This is the territory in which contemporary Anglophone philosophical exploration into questions of meaning in life hangs out. This is the area. Within each of the categories, there are many divergent views, and by most philosophers' lights, no strand of thought on the topic is entirely fully developed at this moment. There is, however, a common thread that runs through all the work as near as I can tell, a thread that takes some of its coloring from the usual ways of distinguishing questions about meaning from questions about happiness. It goes like this. In virtually all contemporary work, except work that is, committed to a sort of hardcore, thoroughly subjectivist naturalism, leave those guys to the side. Meaningful lives are meaningful in part because those leading meaningful lives operate with an understanding of their lives as participating in a good larger than their own welfare or advantage, and the welfare or advantage of those they regard as members of their intimate circle. Okay, what sort of larger is involved in this larger good? Thaddeus Metz offers the following proposal. Quote, "The concept of meaning is the idea of connecting with intrinsic value beyond one's animal self. The animal self is constituted by those capacities that we share with lower animals, i.e., those not exercising reason. These include the fact of being alive, the instantiation of a healthy body, and the experience of pleasures. These internal conditions may well be intrinsically valuable, but they do not seem to be the sorts of intrinsic value with which one must connect to acquire significance. To say that the concept of meaning is the idea of relating positively to intrinsic value beyond one's animal self is to say that while merely staying alive or feeling pleasure, is to say that these cannot make one's life meaningful, connecting with internal goods involving the use of reason and with all sorts of external goods can do so." Close quote. Now, perhaps more than any other Anglophone analytic philosopher working on questions about the meaning of life, Metz is immersed in the whole of the relevant contemporary literature. He covers the waterfront better than anyone else. And he's acutely aware of the points at which his treatment of the concept departs from some recent analytic work on the topic. For all that, one can complain about various features of Metz's account of the concept of meaning from a Thomist point of view. Here's a few of them. First, Metz's way of distinguishing what we share with non-human animals from our distinctively human capacity diverges from Aquinas' metaphysics of human nature. For Aquinas, we are the animals with intellect. Intellect is not the same as what contemporary philosophers mean by reason. In an early work, Aquinas remarks on aspects of non-human animal apprehension and appetite that have something of reason in them. Quote, "It should be noted that not only in the apprehensive powers, but also in the appetitive, there is something which belongs to the sensitive soul in accordance with its own nature, and something else according as it has some slight participation in reason, coming into contact at its highest level of activity with reason at its lowest. Thus, the imaginative power belongs to the sensitive soul in accordance with its own nature, because forms received from sense are stored up in it, but the estimative power, by which an animal apprehends intentions not received by the senses, such as friendship or hostility, is in the sensitive soul according as it shares somewhat in reason. The same principle is verified also in regard to the appetitive power. The fact that an animal seeks what is pleasurable to its senses, the business of the concupiscible power, is in accordance with the sensitive soul's own nature. But that it should leave what is pleasurable and seek something for the sake of a victory which it wins with pain, the business of the irascible, this belongs to it according as it has as it in some measure reaches up to the higher appetite." Close quote. It's hard to separate the most complex operations of non-human animal apprehension and appetite from their simplest human counterparts. For all that, intellect sets humans apart from other animals on this view, and among intellectual creatures, humans are further distinguished by having discursive reason. We are, as Aristotle might put it, the chatty animals. This is, for Aquinas, part of the way in which we are animals, not like something else. Second, not just any intrinsically valuable, discursively accessible goods will count as goods to which we can connect in a way that confers meaning on our lives. Active participation in a thriving human community, for example, will only count as lending significance and meaning to one's life if that community is itself ordered to justice and guided by due concern for the common good. If we had to find a slot for Aquinas in the contemporary philosophical taxonomy, he will count as a supernaturalist for whom the metaphysical, relational, and ethical dimensions are all intertwined. Finally, concern about virtue is kept at a distance in Metz's treatment of meaning. If we wanted to ask Aquinas to speak to questions about meaning in human life, virtue would have an important place in our discussion. How will a friend of Aquinas handle a question about the place of virtue in a meaningful life? First off, a friend of Aquinas, if I understand us, will urge that a properly virtuous human life will, insofar as it's virtuous, be a meaningful life. It may not be a happy life on any ordinary understanding of happiness. I can be as wise, just, brave, and temperate as you please, but face ethical circumstances so challenging and hostile that my good character makes me a target for abuse rather than an esteemed person. In this sense, a Thomist account will square with the first and third of the starting points for an account of meaning. Second, the fact that even a person with a full complement of acquired virtues, a strong character, can make mistakes and will occasionally have good reason to regret her decisions and her actions, squares with the objectivity constraint on claims to meaning in human life. I might throw myself into a cause, for example, after careful consideration and in good conscience, only to find that the thing I fought for was not worth fighting for. Third, because acquired virtue on Aquinas' understanding is perfective of my nature as a human being, virtuous lives are better than vicious lives, in a sense isomorphic with the sense in which meaningful lives are better than meaningless lives. Perhaps most importantly, because acquired virtues are directed to common good in the first instance for Aquinas, a genuinely virtuous life will, by necessity, involve the right kinds of relations with intrinsically valuable internal and external goods to meet the kind of criterion for meaning sketched by Metz, where Metz is here echoing dominant trends in contemporary Anglophone philosophical work on the topic. In this sense, putting Aquinas into conversation with contemporary Anglophone philosophers on questions about meaningful lives gives thought about virtue a central role in thought about meaning, underlining the sense in which morals and meaning are both inherently self-transcendent. Thank you.
We're now taking questions, and we have until about 4:15. And traditionally, I think, a student poses the first question. May we please have a traditional student question? First thing was a statement, the second was a command.
No one. This is such a sad moment.
My question would be, is there any way to measure like how virtuous a person is and like how that correlates to how meaningful their life is or will be?
Well, thank you. There's certainly a lot of social scientists who are working on ways of trying to measure both things. Okay. The methodology is difficult. Some of the most interesting stuff is connected to a series of projects that are coming out of Wake Forest University, on virtue at least, where instead of asking me just like how good I am or something, there's one set of experiments that just sort of ask me what I'm up to all the time. And they've got a set of kinds of activities that they take to be characteristic of people with good character, like helping other people and so on. And they have folks who carry around little smartphones that click them, little devices that ask them at many, many points in the day all kinds of questions. They also are running a series of actually longitudinal experiments or studies which involve things like asking people who know you to talk about your character, so that it's not just self-reports, it's trying to get a sense of the kind of difference you make in the lives of the people around you. Those are the kinds of actual attempts to measure this stuff that I know about. And there's other kinds of projects that are being done at a lot of other places. I kind of, because of the Templeton project, learned about a lot of these things. Most of them having to do with questions about virtue, usually broken down into questions about specific virtues, rather than like a nice Thomist overall harmonious coordination of your powers in pursuit of genuine human good or something like that, which is a little more objective than you can get out of social science. I am not aware of what I would take to be even mildly probative attempts to measure meaning. It's a lot easier to measure despair. You can chart it in things like serious suicide attempts as opposed to the ones that get called cries for help. Various forms of self-destructive behavior. Major depressions, things like that. I think it's fair to treat the statistics on those kinds of conditions as a way of tracking the dark side of lives that are not being experienced as meaningful. Does that make sense? And there's a ton of information about that because it's a big set of problems. Does that help?
Thank you. I know you know this, but for the benefit of some folks who don't, when I was listening to your list of the sort of characteristics of what you are sort of stipulating, or at least staking your claim out of, what are the characteristic features of meaning, you emphasize the objective condition, and you sort of mentioned the appeal of the subjective condition, but it seemed like you didn't include that. And as you know, but some others might not, in Susan Wolf's version, she says you need both. And so part of what I'm wondering, I guess I have a lot of questions here, but I'll just pick one. So how different is what Wolf calls active engagement, this subjective relationship to these objectively meaningful things that she thinks is necessary? How different is that from, I think you described in the Thomist view, this sort of active participation in the right sort of society, or more generally, the sort of the right relation to these objectively meaningful values? So how different do you think those kind of relations are from what Wolf characterizes as sort of the subjective feature of active engagement as a necessary subjective element in meaning?
For the most part, I share Wolf's sense that there has to be some subjective element. I was more impressed than Wolf was by a movie called It's a Wonderful Life. The movie called It's a Wonderful Life convinced me when I was too young to have philosophical views about things, even, I think, that you could actually be leading a very worthwhile life and not know it, right? Now, it's non-accidental that that what makes the turning point, the precondition for the turning point, is a case of despair. And I will certainly agree that to be actively engaged in a meaningful life, I need to be at some distance from despair. So to that extent, I agree. That's not what the subjectivists mean. The subjectivist means I can't be wrong. Like if I tell you my life is going great, I've got a meaningful life, I'm engaged in all and only worthwhile activities, blah, 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 I think I can be wrong about that. I think Wolf really does too. So, I mean, to say that to agree that you can't be in a state of despair about your life, which that does, to some extent, track a subjective element. I also think that you can't be unconsciously engaged in all this virtuous activity and participating in the daily production and reproduction of sound modes of sociality and not notice, right? So to that extent, I also think that that a subjective condition is a necessary part.
Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. Since you kind of stressed the insufficiency of natural virtues alone, I'm wondering if you think it's necessary to speak also about infused virtues. And if so, if you could say something about how you see the relationship between the natural acquired virtues and the infused virtues.
Big fan of infused virtues. I think it's actually a hard topic. Angela Knoebel at CUA has done some really brilliant work on infused virtue, I think. And along with Jean Porter and Angela Knoebel, I think that some of the most interesting ones are the infused counterparts of the acquired virtue, and trying to think about exactly what's going on when you've got the infused counterparts to acquired virtues. The simplest thing to say about it is that the infused virtues have a different source from the acquired virtues. They really are from God. And they've got a different end. If I've got some, they're pointing me to my supernatural end rather than just to being in right relations with my fellow human beings and engaging in, say, sound forms of shared worship or something, or communal spiritual life, religious life. Okay. It's hard to come up with a commonsensical, everyday picture of the difference between the two. One way of doing it might look like this. Suppose I have acquired justice. If I've got acquired justice in me, operative in a sound way, I am alert to and alive to the need to give each of my fellow human beings his or her due. Okay? So I'm alive to everyone in this room as a fellow human being, and there's all kinds of things that inform how I am with them. It might be the case that if I have infused justice, every being in this room is for me in the first instance a child of God, and I'm Christian, so every human being in this room is somebody for whom Jesus died. Now, it might be that some of the behaviors I have toward my fellow human beings are the same, whether I'm working from infused or acquired justice. It's not like I'm going to change how I pay debts, or I'm going to refrain from some of the same things either way. But for me, at least, concentrating on the fact that every person in this room is someone for whom Jesus died sets a higher standard on how I interact with them. It sets a higher standard than just the demands of justice. That's a way to think about it. Obviously, if you've got the fullness of infused virtue, your whole character is reoriented and shaped in a different way from love. And caritas, I mean, you are to some extent in a position to be a vessel for God's love working in the world, instead of just, especially warm, fuzzy feelings or something for people. But the infused virtues, nothing in the text that I can see magnificent and awe-inspiring as the infused virtues are. Nothing in the texts suggests to me that if I have a full complement of infused virtue, which is like all three of the theological virtues and the infused counterparts of all the acquired virtues, I'm never going to mess up. I mean, I'm still a human being. So it's still possible that I could mess up. It's just that my whole orientation is to my real final end, in ways that go beyond anything I could conjure up on my own, even if I had the world's best parents or something. Does that get anywhere near it?
Thank you.
Thanks, Candace. So I have a question about the claim that all other things being equal, a meaningful life is better than a meaningless life. Mm-hmm. So I take it that one strong point of a kind of Aristotelian approach to ethics is that there's no mystery why I should strive to be happy, right? Because just happiness is just by definition what I am always striving for. But you've said that happiness and meaningfulness are two different things. So why should I pursue a meaningful life?
Okay, I have to say, I'm like somebody for whom the happiness claim has never been intuitive. As far as I know, I've never consciously thought, oh, if only I could be happy. Not because I'm super happy. It's not like, generally, by most subjective counts, I'm not particularly happy. I mean, it's like I read the paper. Like, how do you manage this? If you do stuff like read the paper and try to engage with students who are really troubled and have a disturbing family and stuff, you're like, what does that even mean? So I'm not somebody who ever understood the happiness thing. I was always like, okay. I have a friend and a colleague who really does feel like everything is about happiness. I never have. Having something worthwhile to do, however, that I can get behind. Trying to be of use to other people, I'm there. Right? Do I think that in any ordinary understanding of the term happy, that's going to make you happy? Maybe. Not me. Even though I've been trying to do it my whole life. So it could just be a temperamental problem or something. It could be that there's cheerful Dominicans who are like, no, happiness is everything. Because I know a lot of really cheerful Dominicans. And it's like you look at them and you're like, yeah, well, maybe, if you're me. And that's one of the things that's really fascinating about people who hear confessions a lot. Right? Because you're in a better position to realize the twistiness in the human soul than I am. But there are at least, maybe what happened was that the impact of those two unbelievably destructive wars made happiness just seem not so available to a lot of European thinkers. And maybe meaning is like the sad second best that you could maybe go for. Maybe, but you know, if you read like Frankl or Primo Levi or Kertész or any of those folks, the point is to take for granted a lot of suffering and see what can be pulled from that, but take that suffering really seriously. I think I've never felt like the sight of a suffering human being looks to me obviously like the sight of somebody who's gone off the rails in terms of having a sense about what matters in life. I often think that there's somebody who has a really clean and clear and often clear-eyed sense of what matters in life. So, I mean, I'm willing to admit that this is the equivalent of an intellectual disability on my part. But I've just never been able to get this thing that a lot of people who work on Neo-Aristotelian stuff take for granted, and that my beloved Aquinas takes on board. It's just that he puts it somewhere else. He doesn't put it here. And I don't know of contemporary Anglophone philosophers who work on happiness who look for it anywhere but here. Because most of them aren't theists or something. Does that help?
And my question sort of, in a way, latched on to that. So you've partly answered it. So my question was, what's the use of foregrounding meaningfulness? What's the importance of foregrounding meaningfulness as a key concept and displacing happiness or the good life? And I guess part of it, my question was motivated by the fact that, by kind of observing that some of the features that you list as characteristics of meaningfulness are ones that people would connect to certain concepts of happiness, like Aristotle's the good life, and so on. So I kind of, so my question would have been, what is gained by displacing one concept by another? And it seems to me, like, judging from what you said, that part of what part of what motivates this shift of focus is the fact that happiness has been kind of hijacked. I don't know if that's the right word, but it has been sort of colored very, very deeply by this more subjective, the kind of the felt experience, the kind of the feeling of happiness. And at this point, it's perhaps not possible or desirable even to try to displace that as a purely issue of semantics. And it's best to sort of move on to this.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't know strategically. Even Aristotle will allow that the level of human suffering that we've witnessed over the past, say, 150 years has hit a magnitude where you couldn't say honestly of the people suffering that they're happy, right? I mean, like what? Friendless, sick, blah, 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 blah. No such person is happy. That's at least one small way in which external goods might be necessary for happiness. But I don't know how to hold a contemporary discussion about happiness that completely ignores questions about suffering, especially the sort of involuntary suffering that comes about through things like famine and war and on and on. poverty, where I don't think it's hysterical to suggest that the statistical majority of human beings are living in very difficult circumstances these days. I also don't think it is wrong to suggest that when those people are banding together or trying to work to support each other and hold each other in the world in the face of all this stuff, that's meaningful activity. Even if you can never go back to Aleppo and have it be a good place to be or something, whatever it is. So part of the reason I actually got more interested in the meaning stuff than the happiness stuff, besides just being temperamentally not well suited to the happiness stuff, is that the meaningfulness stuff gives you a thing to say that's available even if the sorts of external goods that Aristotle rightly takes to be very important aspects of human happiness are in very short supply.
I was struck by your gloss in your starting points on meaning and a meaningful life by use of the expression, a life worth living.
Yep.
And that, I couldn't help but be reminded of Socrates' famous remark that the unexamined life is not worth living for a human being. Now, that's pretty far from some of the things we've just been talking about, but I'm wondering if that plays any role in more contemporary discussions of meaningfulness.
It does, not in quite the way that the Socrates of the Apology, that's a pretty deeply examined life that's being described. But at least an element of reflectiveness. Even people in very desperate circumstances can ask themselves questions about and say to themselves things like, it would not be worth living if I could find no place. I mean, in a way, Viktor Frankl's work on people who managed to get out of Auschwitz is work on people who struggled to find an other person they could help. And some of Primo Levi's writings are writings about finding an other place where you could help. And even Imre Kertész, who's my favorite of these guys, where there's not a whole lot of positive sociality, is engaged in complicated ways with the other people around him, and there is at least the sort of sad efforts on a work crew or something to be there with each other. At a reflective level. At a reflective level. And so, and I mean, what somebody like Metz means when he talks about reason, I think properly understood isn't like, here's how much greater than a dolphin I am. It's more like, I am reflecting on the life I'm leading over here. and trying to direct it. There's some, even under very difficult conditions. So yeah, I'm all in favor of reflective and self-examined lives.
Okay.
And so are the other people who work on this stuff.
Let me see if I'm getting your understanding of meaning and could transpose it into the way Thomas might talk about the same type of thing. Would it be that a meaningful life is a life that is ordered to a genuine and not merely a dispensable good, and that you have recognition of that ordering such that you can make sense of the deprivation of those dispensable or particular goods? Would it be a kind of wisdom, something akin to the gift of wisdom, either at the natural or perhaps at the supernatural level?
Wisdom would certainly be in accordance with it, and certainly the gift of the Spirit is going to be in accordance with this. Ordered appropriately and self-consciously ordered to a genuine good, you bet. And ordered to it, you bet. Even if your circumstances are so constrained and difficult that your sphere of activity is pretty restricted, you bet. That's a way to do it. I always say that one of the things he has going over Aristotle is that whatever he's doing in his practical philosophy and his theology has to be capable of recognizing as morally exemplary beings the canon of the saints. And that group and the kind of teaching that they have for us, very different from the sort of teaching that you expect to find in Aristotle. I mean, you've got an illiterate woman who's like a major figure, and your central figure, the incarnate God, is a humble figure, and your apostles are not intellectuals. And a whole lot of your martyrs are mostly remarkable for having died for the faith. So to be able to recognize that cast of figures as having something to teach us morally, I think means that you need to get real in a serious way about what actually looks like a very important aspect of a human life, and a human life lived in ordered in an appropriate way.
So that's actually great. What I was thinking about, which since we're clearly comfortable talking about like God and theological grace, all of these things.
I figure this is a safe place for that. I guess we'll find out after if I'm wrong.
Maybe just the cross behind you, but probably that's true. So I was wondering. We're also a little happiness allergic, maybe.
Just me, not every. Most people in the room probably are not.
I was wondering what bearing some of these ideas might have on the idea of heaven and paradise after death. Because I think often about heaven as like this place where you go after being a morally good person, where you get to be even morally better forever. And that's what you do, and it's great. But there's no more like writing books, building tall buildings, right? All of this stuff that like we sort of associate as human achievement. You know, we're done with that. We get to rest now and just be morally excellent and stare at God. But I was wondering, you know, if we're having maybe more of an ethics of meaning and of worth, right? You spoke earlier about like, what's this happiness thing? I'm more interested in the kind of actionable question about how can we do something worthwhile. And I think I share your feeling. What does that then say about something like heaven, right? I mean, do we get there and continue this one's trend of worthwhile activities?
I have no idea. Even some of the things that Aquinas writes about the resurrected life, I have no idea. I don't know. I have no way of imagining as an intellectual animal, discursive reason, what on earth would be involved in my being able to even, certainly to participate in God's life and God's sense of God, God's self-understanding, or God's understanding of anything. But in some of the passages, it seems as though what would be going on in a resurrected life is that I would share in God's life in a direct way that I can't imagine. My sense is I wouldn't mind missing out on cooking dinner. My sense is that whatever that is, it's so great that it would be okay to avoid, trying to help my nieces do projects and stuff. But I have no idea. So, I know Pieper sometimes wrote in that Silence of St. Thomas, but wrote as though he thinks that why Aquinas stopped writing is because he was gifted with a glimpse of something. And I would love it if Aquinas got gifted with a glimpse of that, but I have no idea what it would mean to even have a glimpse. So I can't help you. There's probably theologians around here who could, but it's over my pay grade.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking the philosopher.